Nous allons discuter du guide d'entretien.
So we're now going to talk about the interview guide.
Notamment de l'élaboration du guide d'entretien.
In particular, how we create this interview guide. So we're going to identify this within the cycle of the survey that you're leading. Once you have received an order, analyze this order to make a research subject. Once you have run through the literature, which allows us to problematize the subject, to mobilize the relevant theoretical concepts. There was the phase where we constructed the hypotheses, and this was run parallel to the construction of research or survey questions. Once these questions and these hypotheses have been defined, we then defined variables, which are an essential part, which are often neglected. And now we reach the choice of methods. We saw that there was a number of possible methods to inform the variables, and amongst these, the interview. And this brings us to the interview guide. So this interview guide must always be linked to the previous upstream process. We must never lose sight of this. In the case of a semi-structured interview, we said that we are in an exploratory phase, which above all will be looking at qualitative aspects. If we want to understand, for example, a meal, how a meal is organized, to see what's on the table, we have to understand if we're looking at forks, glasses, plates, before we can actually count them. This might appear to be very trivial to say this, but if you place yourself within the context of your own works or project yourself forwards to the works that you are considering, then very often we actually begin counting things before we've even qualified them. One example, which would be in the field of a research survey, would be, for example, coal. Before counting bags of coal that are produced, we have to understand what the coal product is, where it comes from, how it is produced by combustion, who is it produced by, why is it produced. Before we can actually try to identify for how much it will be sold, the weight of a bag, by doing several weighing campaigns, for example, or by asking the person how much the bag weighs. And we can, of course, make it a triangle with the weighing with this. We can count the number of lorries that go past, transporting so many bags of coal. And before this, we have to understand what the product is, what it's used for, and what it represents for the different players. So we need to understand the object and qualify the object before we quantify it. That's the distinction between the qualitative and the quantitative. Researching qualitative elements requires open questions. Quantitative research requires closed questions. Open questions give rise to longer responses than those given to closed questions. An open question, for example, might be, what is your activity? And the person will be able to describe their activities. And if you find that the person is not developing sufficiently the explanation of their different activities, you can use relaunch questions. We'll come back to this. The closed question on quantitative aspects might be, for example, how many bags of coal or charcoal did you produce, for example? or how many of your mothers or cows are feeding their young at the moment. The words are different. Questions which begin by which will open the question, whereas how many will close a question. There are situations where it's necessary to introduce an open question with a verb so that it's not too sudden. Once the interview is underway, this will not be so necessary, and it would be better to avoid these verbs. These verbs can be: tell us about what you've done since you set up here. But if you say tell us, it's not the same as explain to us. So you have to be very attentive to the type of verb, which can introduce a bias or a direction that you do not wish to go down. It can introduce a direction that you do wish to go down, and therefore you must use it. So tell us about will give a story. Explain to us will give an argumentation. We must be aware of this, and then according to this you can use one or the other verb or no verbs at all. So when I was speaking about open and closed questions, I talked about specific questions. So, specific questions. There are prompt questions, precision questions, and clarification questions. So, prompt questions, the person you're interviewing will be talking about a subject and you want them to go more in depth. A prompt question, once we've understood what it is actually the easiest to implement, and it works very well. So, it's a question of briefly reformulating what the person has said and encourage them to say a little bit more. The question to specify things, the precision question, the idea is to formulate something new, a new question, on a point that you would like the person to explore further. With regard to this element, could you tell us a little bit more? Or with regard to this element, could you specify how you manage reproducers, for example? The question of clarification always considers something that you have not understood. You just need to say, I didn't understand this point. Could you please explain it to me? In the interview guide, we are working on adapting vocabulary. So what is in our mind, what is clear for us, is not necessarily clear to the other person. The other person has another culture, and we have to adapt our own vocabulary to their culture. And yet you must remain in your own language. So as a French woman, if I go and interview French farmers, French mothers, or people in charge of a French association, I will not be using the same vocabulary for one or the other. I will make a translation as Calon defined, in order to be understood and in order to collect the information that I wish to obtain to inform the variables that I established upstream. In the work that you must do in building your interview guide, which will be adapted in the form of a few questions, open questions, few questions, but sufficiently well built so that they have the full power necessary to provide you with the information you are seeking. So, in the formulation of these questions, you must make sure that the form is a personal form addressed to the person you're interviewing. What does this mean? It means that you use a pronoun, the pronoun you, for the person, and not an impersonal form, which would be one. You would say, what are your activities, for example? Another example, how do you see the changing landscape? And it's above all when there's a translation in another language that the shift towards the impersonal form actually occurs. Your translator will say, he said that. He's asking you if. And The translator must really translate how do you see the changing landscape. And so it's above all with regard to this use of translation that the impersonal form might slip in. And you must be very careful of this. Your translator must ask the question exactly as you formulated it, with this direct personal address to the person you're interviewing. It is necessary to take into account the status and position of the person you're interviewing. Either you've chosen this person due to a precise status and you are interviewing them as a mayor, as a farmer, as a shopkeeper, and yet these people could have different statuses and positions, and you might be aware of them beforehand, and you might have chosen to interview this person with regard to a particular status or a certain number of statuses, but at all points you must question yourself and make sure where you stand, whether you're speaking as a mayor, as a farmer, or even a mixture of the two. Man is plural, as Laie said. And this plurality can be real. I can speak with different roles. I can speak as a researcher, as a mother, as a woman, or just as a researcher, without taking into account my status as a woman. So you must apprehend all of this. Either you ask the question to the person, as a mayor, can you tell me this? Or if the person is speaking, you can ask them to explain if they're speaking as a mayor, as a farmer, or if it's an indefinite mix of both, which certainly can exist on different subjects. So we've just seen different points, the type of the survey or research in qualitative and quantitative terms, which are expressed also through the type of question, open or closed. We've seen adaptation of vocabulary, and we talked about the issue of translation. And the fourth point was regarding the status, the position of the person you're interviewing. And this fifth point talks about the order of the themes to be approached. We need a minimum amount of order. Of course, the semi-structured interview allows a variable order in the themes approached, and we must have this freedom to ensure flexibility, a better exchange to gain people's trust. We don't want to go from something said by the person you interviewed to something that you want to see immediately. You need a certain amount of patience. However, it can't be done in just any direction. You have to set off from the most general and moving towards the most specific. If we're working on the representation that people have of the landscape, we will not begin with this and then ask the people we're interviewing what is the most important for them. We will begin with what is the most important for them, and then we will see where the landscape stands with regard to their concerns. If you begin with the landscape, you cannot then know what the relative value is with regard to other possible themes.